Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. Today we're going to spend some time looking at a couple of issues in the news. A lot of what we're going to say today has to do with Islam. A little bit later, Jay Sekulow will join us as we talk about his new book, The Rise of ISIS. I have some things to say about the president's speech and the National Prayer Breakfast and some of the fallout there, Sharia law in America, and much more. But I thought before we spend probably most of our program today on Islam, there was at least one story that a lot of people have been talking about. We really have not addressed it here on Point of View, and I thought for just a few minutes we might talk about Brian Williams and what has been happening at NBC. Not because I spend much time, nor do I think we should spend much time talking about who's up and who's down and who's in the chair and who's outside the chair and who's in the position of influence and who is not. But this might be a lesson that some of us can learn about embellishment, as well as maybe just a little bit of an understanding of the way in which news is actually portrayed today, and maybe a little bit of what happens inside a news organization, because we now know that the story that actually was the downfall of Brian Williams was just one of many stories where he significantly exaggerated what he did and his accomplishments. And it was certainly well known, we now find out, from those people at NBC, and they simply chose not to do anything about it. So I thought for just a minute I might address this issue. You can go to our website, pointofview.net, and see one of the articles I'm going to read from for a few minutes. And it's from Jonah Goldberg. And he says, by now, everyone knows about his transgressions. If some of the reports are true, Brian Williams is a serial embellisher or a self-aggrandizing fabulist. And if that's a new word for you, fabulist is somebody that tells fables. No doubt everyone knows someone like this, and if you don't, it's probably because you're that guy. But Williams' case is special. He isn't some sad Willie Loman at the end of the bar who needs to invent impressive stories about himself. If anything, he needed to not tell such stories, given that he reported makes more than $10 million a year to be a trusted name in news. Yet, as Jonah Goldberg says, he couldn't stop himself. Then he quotes from a writer for the New York Times who said, quote, "To walk down a street with an anchor is to be stunned both by how many people recognize them and how many viewers call to them about specific stories." That writer in the New Yorker also goes on to say, there's a respectful familiarity different from the awe displayed to Hollywood celebrities. The anchor is treated as the citizen's trusted guide to the news. As a result, they can feel expected to dominate discussions, to tell war stories, and to play God. Jonah Goldberg goes on to say, I have no doubt that's true, but I'm also certain that Williams is hearing only from people who see him as their trusted guide to the news, and that can be very deceptive. Jonah Goldberg says, if Kathy Griffin is a quintessential D-list celebrity, then I'm probably somewhere south of Z. But I can get recognized at airports and restaurants from time to time, mostly because of my stints on Fox News. A couple times a year, someone will come up and compliment me, or they'll compliment the Weekly Standard Stephen Hayes, thinking I'm him. But you know what virtually never happens. Someone coming up to me to tell me how much they hated my column, my comments, my book, my face, or my existence. Now, all you have to do is peek at the comment thread at this column to know that such people exist. Some mornings, my inbox is like the Ark of the Covenant in the first Indiana Jones movie. One look inside will melt your face. Yet almost none of these people ever say anything to me personally. If I didn't know better, and believe me, I do, I might get a pretty skewed impression of what the public thinks of me. I might say that I've had some of that experience as well, although since I cut my teeth before I did this, speaking on college campuses, I did have and have had people come up to my face and tell me how much they dislike me. I can remember one particular situation at the American Jewish Congress where during the question-and-answer period, this one woman stood up and before the entire audience said, "I've read some of Kirby Anderson's columns in the Dallas Morning News, and I disagree with everything he says." And then she sat down next to my wife, who pretended to look at her shoes for the next couple of minutes. But, you know, those kinds of things sometimes happen, but I understand the point. Most people come up to you and say, "Hey, good to see you, glad to see you, oh, appreciate what you're doing," and later on they say to their friends, "I can't believe that jerk." And here, again, is one of the things that I think Jonah Goldberg has as a really good perspective, and that is that some of this simply because he believed his press clippings and some of the comments he made. And so he went on to say, "I can only imagine what it must be like for truly famous people who live in Olympian redoubts, protected from criticism among people with a professional interest in their divinity." He said, "I recently talked to a donor close to Mitt Romney. He said that one of the reasons Romney briefly flirted with a third run for the White House is that he spent the last 2 years hearing from fans telling him he should run again. They'd come up to him at airports and parties and say only flattering and encouraging things." He says it's easy to imagine how misleading that could be. No one was going to run up to Romney and say, "Don't ever think about running again." It was only when he actually tested the sincerity of the flattery that he discovered he was getting a false market signal. And that's Mitt Romney, a vastly more controversial figure. Until this story broke, Brian Williams was an unobtrusive, news-reading mannequin who occasionally broke character to tell jokes and fake tales of valor on late-night talk shows. Perhaps he told these stories because deep down he knew that he was a false idol, or maybe not. But it is instructive to watch Williams' fellow media Olympians rally to his defense. They have an investment in a system that rewards celebrity so handsomely and not just financially. They are the last beneficiaries of the old order when nightly news anchors were cultivated to be the voice of God, as insiders at CBS used to call the position. Those days are gone, he says. In a recent Pew Research Center survey, only 27% of respondents could correctly identify Williams from his photograph, and only 3% could say what he did for a living. Matter of fact, 3% thought he was Tom Brokaw, and 2% thought he was Joe Biden. Thanks to social media, which was Williams' undoing and Dan Rather's, we are living in the twilight of the idols. But as always, the last people to let go of the old gods are their loyal priests. A couple of lessons we can learn there. First of all, how the organization known as NBC put up with that for so long. Apparently, there were times when people did say, you know, you've really got to dial this back. You really have got to stop making up some of these stories. It's not helping your credibility. But I think it's also a warning to all of us that it is very easy to embellish. That fish that you caught, it gets bigger every year, doesn't it? You know, the individual that you had to fight on the playground, boy, he got a lot tougher over the years. And boy, if you look at resumes as I do, you really wonder how many things that people put on their resumes are really true. And this is just one more reminder that I think all of us need to be careful how we communicate. But I think we can also learn a very important lesson as well, and that is the mainstream media is having a crisis. And now they're talking about Jon Stewart stepping down, and maybe he'd even step into this position. Boy, that would change the news business. And so those are just a couple of quick observations. If you'd like to make some, 1-800-351-1212. When we come back, most of our time today will be talking about Islam, and if you would like to join us on that conversation as well, we would certainly welcome your phone calls. If you'd like to read what I've just read, we have that on our website, pointofview.net. We'll come back and talk about a few other very important issues in the news right after this.
The Point of View Commentary with Kirby Anderson.
You know, White House spokesmen have lately been claiming that the Taliban is not a terrorist organization. We can speculate as to why the Obama administration is making this argument in just a moment, but let's look at the facts. Under federal law, a group qualifies as a foreign terrorist organization if it meets three requirements. First, it must be foreign. Second, it must be engaged in terrorist activity, which would include bombings or assassinations. And third, it must be a national security threat to the United States. I would think that anyone looking at the facts would have to conclude that the Taliban in Afghanistan qualifies as a terrorist organization. The reason the U.S. sent troops into Afghanistan was due to its involvement in global jihad. When the Taliban ruled Afghanistan, they allowed groups like al-Qaeda to set up headquarters there and attack U.S. embassies and eventually to attack America on 9/11. The Taliban still has alliances with groups like al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, and the Muslim Brotherhood. Andrew McCarthy believes he knows the reason why the current administration does not want to call the Taliban a terrorist organization. They try to distinguish between insurgents and terrorists. To them, an insurgency is a domestic uprising. But if they use terrorist tactics, McCarthy argues that at the very least they should be called domestic terrorists, and the Taliban is more than just an Afghanistan phenomenon. Andrew McCarthy understands these issues. He's a former federal prosecutor who convicted the notorious Blind Sheikh and other jihadists who attempted in 1993 to destroy the World Trade Center. McCarthy believes the Obama administration continues to reject the terrorist label for the Taliban because the administration wants to negotiate with the Taliban. As a nation, we've rejected the idea of negotiating with terrorists because that might encourage them to engage in more terrorist acts. Instead, the administration believes it should negotiate with the Taliban as insurgents. This administration may not want to call the Taliban a terrorist organization, but their attempt doesn't square with the facts. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Open line if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We're going to get to some of the comments by the president at the National Prayer Breakfast. I've kind of waited a while to react to that as well, simply because there have been some very good things written by people that we've had on this program and respect. But let's take one phone call from that first segment, as we talked a little bit about Brian Williams and what is called the NBC's Puffed Up Anchor, piece by Jonah Goldberg. And let's see if we can go to Greg in South Carolina. Greg, thank you for joining us today.
Yes. Thanks for being there. What I have to say is simply that ever since Rather's error, we just need to add one new word to our lexicon, called rathering. Basically, we've got a media in which the message is more important than the truth. We saw this happening in the Trayvon Martin case with the photography that was posted by the media with NBC. We've seen it before, and I wouldn't doubt that Williams is just getting a paid vacation.
Yeah, he might. Well, I don't know what will happen there.
Purpose, and this is a paid vacation.
Could be right now because a paid leave. Let me come back to it because the way you described it is one way to describe it. I thought there's, and that is that you don't let the truth get in the way of the message. Maybe a better way is to don't let facts get in the way of the narrative. A lot of people are starting to say that news isn't so much about the facts anymore, it's about the narrative. And if the narrative is we have racism in America, if the narrative is
whatever that might be, that maybe that government is good, the narrative is that fundamentalists are dangerous, whatever that narrative might be, then because that's the narrative, that's the structure by which the news will be reported, facts that fit that narrative will be included, and facts that don't fit that narrative are excluded. And if you've ever watched one of the CSI programs, you know that oftentimes they'll have the principals say, we're going to let the facts lead to the conclusion. We're not going to prejudge the facts. And that should be the way all of us evaluate things. That certainly should be the way in which news should be presented, but it isn't. And so I think your point's well taken. Dan Rather, I did quote from Jonah Goldberg. He wrote an earlier piece that quoted back or when Dan Rather engaged in all of that. And I think he used the phrase, if you'll appreciate this, that Dan Rather climbed up on the stupid tree and then hit every branch on the way down, because Jonah Goldberg was saying this is probably not as big a deal as Dan Rather, because after all, he quickly admitted to the embellishment, although some people said that his apology wasn't honest either, and that might have led to his downfall. But compared to what Dan Rather did, certainly it's a little bit different. So, Greg, I appreciate that, Rathery, and the fact that sometimes we won't let the facts get in way of the particular news narrative. Let me move on, though, because one of the other topics that we really haven't addressed very much here on Point of View was the president's speech at the National Prayer Breakfast. If you go to our website, pointofview.net, you will see, first of all, that we have a piece by Dennis Prager, and then I'm going to read some things from Ravi Zacharias. If we have some time, also some from Jerry Newcomb. But again, the president in his speech at one point said, "And lest we get on our high horse and think that this is unique to some other place, remember that during the Crusades and the Inquisition, people committed terrible deeds in the name of Christ. In our own home country, slavery and Jim Crow all too often was justified in the name of Christ, so this is not unique to one group or one religion." I love what Dennis Prager says. He says it's important to analyze these words because the President of the United States spoke them in a major forum, and because what he said is said by all those who defend Islam against any criticism. Referring to Islamic violence, the President accuses anyone who implies that such religious violence is unique to some other place, meaning outside of Christian West, as getting on a high horse. Dennis Prager asks the question, is this true? He says, of course not. In our time, major religious violence is in fact unique to some other place, namely the Islamic world. What other religious group is engaged in mass murder, systematic rape, slavery, beheading innocents, bombing public events, shooting up school children, wiping out whole religious communities, and other such atrocities? The answer, of course, is no other religious group. Therefore, massive violence in the name of one's religion today is indeed unique to some other place. To state that it is not, to get on a high horse, it is to tell the most important truth about the world in our time. Would the president have used the high horse example argument 30 years ago regarding Western condemnation of South African apartheid? Of course not, because contempt of Western evils is noble, while contempt for non-Western, especially Islamic evils, is to get on your high horse. Well, he goes on, and you can read the whole piece, but I thought it was instructive to see that one way to respond to the president's comment is to recognize that indeed we can't say that it is all equal. And I've used this example sometimes when I've been on college campuses when somebody brings up the Crusades, and that is to say, well, okay, when did the Crusades begin? That's usually a stumper for most of them, 1095 in case you'd like to know. Then I oftentimes say, which one, of the Crusades? There's about 7 different ones that have been listed over time. Do you have a problem with? Again, that usually brings a lot of silence because this is just a catchphrase. Most people haven't studied the Crusades. I have a whole chapter in my book, A Biblical Point of View on Islam, because I know it will come up. But I thought it would be good just to also quote from Ravi Zacharias, who's been on the program with us, who again talked about the fact that the president addressed this issue on February 5th. And he goes on to say, for those who did not hear the talk, it is sufficient to say that it was the most ill-advised and poorly chosen reprimand ever given at the National Prayer Breakfast. He says, I've been to several and have never, ever heard such absence of wisdom in a setting such as this. which is quite a statement, by the way, from Ravi Zacharias. I wasn't at this one, but have heard the speech often enough to marvel at the motivation of such thoughts. President Obama basically lectured Christians not to get on a moral high horse in their castigation of ISIS atrocities by reminding them of the Crusades and slavery were only justified in the name of Christ. Citing the Crusades, Ravi Zacharias says, he used the single most inflammatory word he could have with which to feed the insatiable rage of the extremists. That is exactly what they want to hear to feed their lunacy. In the Middle East, history never dies, and words carry the weight of revenge. There is so much I would love to say in response, but still shall refrain. So Ravi Zacharias does go on and say this. The president obviously does not understand the primary sources of either faith for him to make such a tendentious parallel. The predominant delight in his remarks would be in the Muslim world and the irreligious. The next day, Geraldo Rivera opined favorably, made the oft-repeated lie that more people have been killed in the name of God than in any other cause. Try telling that to the Chinese and Russians and the Cambodians and the victims of the Holocaust. Such intellectual ignorance gains the microphone with pitiable privilege. If a thinking person doesn't know the difference between the logical outworkings of a philosophy and the illogical ones, to say nothing of the untruth perpetuated, then knowledge has been sacrificed on the altar of prejudice. I might just mention before I go on, Ravi Zacharias talks about the numbers of those who have been killed under, say, atheism compared to those who were killed in the name of God. And Dinesh D'Souza, in one of his books, actually runs the numbers, and you can find it in his book, and concludes at the end that even if you count all the things that could be considered religious wars, of which there are some, but many others just use religion as an excuse. But even if you take all of those that you could call religious wars and compare that just to the incredible Holocaust of the 20th century, Hitler, Stalin, and Mao alone, they can't even come close, either in terms of sheer numbers or even percentages. And so, again, very important statement. But finally, he says, Ravi Zacharias says, let me get to the president's final statement after he wandered off to erroneous territory. The final remark was true, and he said, it is sin that leads us to distort reality. He was right. In fact, he embodied it in his talk. But there's good news for the president. At least in the Christian message, forgiveness is offered for sin. In Islam, it isn't. You earn it. May I dare suggest that if Christians had been burning Muslims and beheading them, he would never dare go to Saudi Arabia and tell them to get off their high horse. He unwittingly paid a compliment to those who preach grace and forgiveness. This is the dominant theme of the gospel. That is why we sit in courtesy listening to the distortion of truth, the abuse of privilege, and the wrong-headedness of a message. Let's take a break, but if you'd like to join us, maybe you have some comments about the president's address at the National Prayer Breakfast, or some of the comments that we've already made about Brian Williams. Those are two issues we put on the table. 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to read some of the things that I've been quoting from, they're on our website, pointofview.net. Let's take a break. Let's take some phone calls, too. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
When you're listening to or watching network news, do you ever start talking to the newsreader or anchor person? Come on, you can admit it, you do, don't you? You can't believe what you're hearing, and you feel the need to correct them. Sometimes you almost feel like you're living in a different world, and you are. People who deny God are living in a world of make-believe. The next time you're shaking your head at the news, I want you to do something. Pick up the phone or write a check or visit us online and give. Point of View brings you a biblically informed analysis of what's happening, but to do it, we need your partnership. Visit pointofview.net and click the link next to Donate Now where it says Become a Monthly Partner. Pointofview.net. Or mail your donation for this month to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. That's Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or call 800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Don't just shake your head. Make a difference. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Put a couple of things on the table here. Some comments, first of all, about the National Prayer Breakfast, and we have posted the piece by Ravi Zacharias. Already have the piece up there by Dennis Prager, and also earlier talking about Brian Williams. We'll continue on in a little bit later, or maybe after our interview with Jay Sekulow, talking about my commentary today on the Taliban, and also one that will be coming out later this week on Sharia law. So lots to cover here, but let's take a few phone calls first and get some of your comments. We'll go up to Alaska. KJNP. Dale, thank you for calling today.
Yes, sir. Thank you. I wanted to mention I've been listening and have never heard anyone make a comment on back when Obama was doing his apology tour at all the foreign countries, and it just seems like the way I remember it, it was before he actually got elected, but maybe it was for the second election. But I vividly remember he was up there talking about how beautiful it was, the morning prayer, the call to prayer.
And he talks about that in his autobiography, too. Yes.
Well, then he said, if there's ever a disparity or conflict, I forget exactly the term he used, but he said, I will always come down on the Muslim side. Yeah. And I don't know how to Google, but that.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of an exaggeration, but the point he's saying is I certainly have a great respect and admiration for Islam, and he, of course, in his formative years, did spend time in a Muslim country, Indonesia. Had his second father, if you will, who was actually providing some of that guidance. He went to a place where he studied Islam, so he's always had a deep appreciation for Islam, and so I think that's more of an accurate statement. But I think it does inform this president in a way that we've never seen in a previous president. His appreciation for Islam, for having ceremonies like Ramadan and others in the White House, very different than anything we've ever had before in the Oval Office.
Yes.
That makes sense. Yes. That's probably the fairest way to say it.
Well, the way I remembered it was that the way he stated it, I thought, boy, that'll keep him from getting elected. Making that statement, because the way I remembered it was definitely if there's any disparity, he was going to come down on the Muslim side. And
I just don't think he quite said it that way. But again, I get your point, and that is certainly he's got appreciation for that. I mean, I don't want to repeat the error twice, because he didn't really say that. He was, of course, president, and of course some of that was known before he became president. But I think the American people said, well, it doesn't matter. Matter of fact, if anything, maybe he can really bridge the divide between the West and Islam. How's that working out for everybody? With the so-called apology tour and the speech that he gave in Cairo and on the rest, we still see that there is an issue that I'm going to address a little bit later, and we're going to hear that primarily in the book by Jay Sekulow, that accommodation with Islam has not worked, and we'll give him a chance in just a little less than a half an hour to explain some of that, because it's a very significant chapter in his book. But appreciate you bringing that up, and that opens up a line if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Let's go to Georgia, and thank you for joining us today.
Oh, hi. How you doing?
What would you like to share with our audience?
Okay, you were saying that now what I'm about to ask, or get your opinion on, and sorry if it comes across wrong, is you stated that no other religion besides basically extreme Muslims are talk about all the bad stuff they've been doing. Was I correct on hearing that?
I think you've misinterpreted it. What Ravi Zacharias was saying is, or even what Dennis Prager was saying is, what happened was, if you want to use the Crusades, okay, let's use the Crusades. Those ended 1,300 years ago. 1,300 or about 700 years ago. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say actually words from the Bible itself.
Well, make your point, and then we can respond to it.
Well, in the Bible, in Exodus, I think it talks about Moses being commanded by God to I don't want to say murder, because it's a strong word, but basically do away with 3,000 people because they were worshiping false idols. And in Deuteronomy, it talks about stoning children to death that act out, stoning children to death that act out, and stoning women or wives if you find out they're not virgins after you marry them. And so, you know, like I said, I'm not trying to get a big debate, but I mean, this is stuff that I read from the Bible itself. It's not something 3,000 years ago. It's stuff that's actually written and people are believing and reading today. In fact, one senator actually was trying to bring back stoning in Mississippi or Alabama, I think it was.
Well, again, I don't even know where you're coming up with that. I've never heard that before. But you know, let's take it as face value, because I think you've raised a good question. That is, we do have some statements. I think probably the strongest one, and the one that I use in my book, A Biblical Point of View on Islam, would be in 1 Samuel, where you have Samuel who hears from the Lord to tell Saul to go out and kill the Amalekites, or Amalekites, depending on how you want to pronounce that. And you might say, okay, who are they? Well, those are the kind of first terrorist group you ever run into. They're the ones that attacked the children of Israel. And so a lot of people say, well, there's a very direct and specific command that is given to Saul to kill the Amalekites. Okay. Well, that is true. It's a direct and specific command for a specific group in the Old Testament theocracy, which is very different than a universally binding principle that you see in the Quran to kill all infidels, all unbelievers, and that are used today by individuals that are part of radical Islam. I can't find anywhere on this planet where somebody is pulling a verse out of 1 Samuel and using that to kill others, because it was a direct and specific command directed in the Old Testament theocracy. Remember, that's in the Old Testament for that particular nation against those individuals. And of course, we've had Paul Copan on to talk about the whole question of the so-called Yahweh wars and all the rest. That is, I think, probably the best example that you could use, and it's not a very good one, because back to the issue of Christianity, let's look at the two founders. I mean, did Jesus command you to go out and to kill? No. As a matter of fact, if you have a literal interpretation of the New Testament, it tells you such things as to love your enemies, to turn the other cheek, to be gracious, to actually pray for those other individuals in the world. And so it is a very gracious kind of offer. What does Muhammad command? Just read in the Quran the various commands to go out and to kill the infidels. Slavery is another one that people like to bring up. Oh, Christianity was used to justify slavery. Well, did Jesus have slaves? No. Did Muhammad have slaves? Yes, he did. So again, the examples that the president kept using were examples which were a violation of biblical ideas, and Christians have actually spoken against that. As a matter of fact, there was speaking of an apology tour, one of my colleagues wrote about this years ago, that there was an apology tour that was done by various Christians all through Europe on the anniversary of the beginning of the Crusades. Again, the Crusades began in 1095, so in 1995, they actually traveled around and apologized for what was done in the Crusades. Have you had Christians apologize for slavery? Yes, you have. Have Christians, spoken out against all sorts of abuses that were done in the name of Christ? Yes. What about Islam? Well, it's really difficult even for the moderate Muslims to speak out on those issues, because the difficulty, as we'll find out in a minute when I quote from Jerry Newcomb, is that you have verses that can be easily used to justify these kinds of actions. So I see a real striking difference, and we've posted the article by Ravi Zacharias. I didn't read all of it, but I think it was extremely well written, and I think it gives you a very good understanding of what indeed took place at the National Prayer Breakfast. Near the end, he even said he could not recall when I'd heard such inappropriate words at so important an occasion in such a crisis. The world is burning with fear and apprehension. We need a message that will inspire and encourage and redeem. He said, ironically, 2 years ago, when Dr. Ben Carson spoke and made some comments about our medical plan and the tax system, the White House demanded an apology from him for straying into controversial terrain because it felt his comments showed disrespect for the president. This year's National Prayer Breakfast speech was a blunder in thought, but there was a silver lining. In the end, President Obama blundered into the truth. Sin distorts, and only Jesus Christ restores the truth. Christ will ever rise up to outlive his pallbearers. Even presidents will have to get off their high horses then and recognize the Lord of life and hope and peace. There will be no such speech-making then, only a prayer of surrender, which is what the National Prayer Breakfast was meant to be in the first place. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and then the second hour today, Jay Sekulow will be with us. He's Chief Counsel of the American Center for Law and Justice. We'll be talking about his New York Times bestseller, The Rise of ISIS, a threat we can't ignore. And so we're going to talk about ISIS and then get into the Taliban and much more in the second hour. But just finishing off some of the comments about the president's address at the National Prayer Breakfast, Jerry Newcomb, who has been on this program before and also a talk show host, said in his latest column, Osama bin Laden, meet Mother Teresa. Salvation Army, meet the Taliban. After all, you're just different sides of the same coin anyway, or so says the president, essentially. Last week, President Obama famously used the National Prayer Breakfast to scold Christians for having more than their share of scallywags who have hijacked their religion, lest we judge these professed Muslims who are killing, raping, and pillaging all over the world. Thus, there is a moral equivalence between Islam and Christianity. We all have our good and our bad apples. Well, Jerry Newcomb goes on to say that the president went on to talk about, of course, as we've already mentioned, the Crusades, the Inquisition, slavery, and Jim Crow. But Jerry Newcomb then asked the question, does the Quran teach that a faithful Muslim should slay the infidel? Yes, this is Surah 9:29. Did Jesus tell us to slay our foes? No, he told us to love our enemies. That's in Matthew 5:44. Of course, Christians haven't always lived up to that, he says. That's part of President Obama's point. But Jerry Newcomb goes on to say it does seem odd when discussing the evil deeds of ISIS, the Islamic State, which we'll talk about more in just a few minutes with Jay Sekulow, because there we're talking about an organization that even this week we hear burned a man alive in a cage. And, of course, the issue of all the other atrocities, when that is compared to the Crusades that effectively ended, Jerry Newcomb says, around 1300. I might even end them earlier than that, depending on how many of these actions you would consider to be part of the Crusades. Of course, Jerry Newcomb says this general idea is not completely unique to President Obama. Great Britain's Prime Minister David Cameron said a few months ago of ISIS, they're not Muslims, they're murderers. And he says, I remember within a relatively short time after 9/11, former President Bill Clinton spoke at Georgetown about the attack and basically blamed the Crusades. He said, one of my favorite books on the subject is Robert Spencer's The Politically Incorrect Guide to Islam and the Crusades. We've talked with Robert Spencer on this program, and I've had him on talking about many of his books. And Jerry Newcomb said, I recently re-interviewed Robert Spencer, who runs the site jihadwatch.org, for my radio program, and I asked him to comment on portions of the president's speech. So here are a couple of comments from that radio interview. Robert Spencer said, quote, one of the things I thought most noteworthy about it was that in trying to make his moral equivalence argument and give people the impression Islam is not in the least different from Christianity and being able to inspire its adherents to violence, is that he had to go back 800 years to the Crusades. The glaring gap there is, you can't point to any other Christian group around the world today or in recent memory that are committing violence in the name of Christianity and trying to justify that violence on the basis of Christian teaching. In contrast, notes Spencer, is Islam, whereas, again quoting from Robert Spencer, quote, whereas there are hundreds of armed Muslim groups around the world that are condoning violence in the name of Islam and justifying that violence on the basis of Islamic text and teaching, unquote. So what about the Crusades? Jerry Newcomb asked Robert Spencer. He said, quote, the Crusades are nothing like Islamic jihad. They were late, tardy, small-scale defensive reactions to 450 years of Islamic jihad that had actually rolled up and conquered and Islamized what had been up until that time half of the Christian world. The Crusades were not based on any teaching about making war against or subjugating unbelievers. That is what jihad is all about, unquote. Jerry Newcomb says, I would add, in short, no Islam, no Crusades. And if you would like to read a little bit more, there's some excellent books on Crusades. I have a chapter in my book, and we could even maybe excerpt some of it and put it on the website if you'd like, because as you begin to learn what came to the Crusades, what happened before that, Christians being executed, actually churches being destroyed, there was one particular leader there that I think at the time, if you'd had prophecy experts, they would have been absolutely convinced that he was the Antichrist because of all the horrendous things that he did. And so eventually there was a decision by some of the leaders, and I'm not even going to even talk about how Christian or non-Christian some of those leaders in the West were, to actually send troops to recapture Jerusalem, which they did for a period of time. And then, of course, it was captured once again by the Muslims under Saladin. But anyway, Jerry Newcomb goes on to ask Robert Spencer, well, then, okay, what about slavery and Jim Crow? And there, Robert Spencer said, well, quote, there you've got a point. Slavery certainly was justified by Southern slave owners and defenders of slavery on the basis of the Old Testament, on the basis of passages of the New Testament as well, unquote. But he goes on to say that President Obama leaves out that the anti-slave forces were also Christian. Were also, in many cases, pastors, people who knew the Scriptures very well. They understood that working out from St. Paul's letter to Philemon and going on from there, people had equal dignity before God, and thus to have one person enslave another is contrary to these understandings. He then went on to say, Robert Spencer went on to say, there was never an abolitionist movement in Islam because Islam does not teach that unbelievers are equal in dignity before God. Muhammad owned slaves, so it's very hard to mount an outcry against slavery. Indeed, slavery is a major problem even today in many Islamic countries. Finally, Jerry Newcomb says every Muslim you see in America is a reminder of the freedom our Judeo-Christian heritage is afforded to people of all faiths or of no faiths. Regardless of the president's moral equivalence, many Muslims are voting with their feet as to which type of system they would like to live under. You can't possibly equate Mother Teresa and Osama bin Laden. Well, just a few comments that probably were overdue, but sometimes I like to wait and see what kinds of commentaries come out. And I do believe that these that we have posted, we've posted the one by Ravi Zacharias and the one by Dennis Prager. I read also one from Jerry Newcomb, would be some good pieces to have for you to read, or maybe even to post on your Facebook page, or if you have a blog, or to send by email, because the conversation that began because of the president's comments about Islam and Christianity and the moral equivalence thereof certainly deserve an answer, and I think they have been very well answered by people like Dennis Prager, Ravi Zacharias, and Jerry Newcomb, many of whom have been on the program with us before, and we'll have them on again. Let's take a break, though. When we come back, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking with Jay Sekulow about his best-selling book, The Rise of ISIS, A Threat We Can't Ignore. We'll not only talk about ISIS, but we'll spend a little bit of time talking about Hamas. And later, I'll have some other comments based upon my commentary today on the Taliban. And then want to move back to this country to ask a fundamental question, and that is, how many of these Muslim ideas are showing up in the courts? I think you'll be surprised, because some of the latest surveys, in particular a research report done by the Center for Security Policy, shows that Sharia law is showing up in American courts a lot more than you might think. That's why so many states now are considering actually implementing a ban on the use of Sharia law in the court system in America. But let's take a break, and just as we do so, you can go to the website today, find those articles I've mentioned. My Viewpoints commentary today was on the Taliban, the resistance on the part of this administration to refer to the Taliban as a foreign terrorist organization. And of course, we have lots of great articles for you to begin to read and to post on various formats where you can expand the influence of point of view. So take the time to read them, to photocopy them, maybe post them on your Facebook page or a blog, or send by email. That's the way you can take advantage of the resources we make available here at Point of View. Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll talk with Jay Sekulow about his book, The Rise of ISIS. That coming up right after this.
Gary Bauer, former Reagan White House official and president of American Values.
I wish I could have a personal conversation with every one of your listeners. Don't make these good people beg for resources. There is nothing more important than a well-informed populace in this country. Abraham Lincoln said that at the end of the day, public opinion in America is everything, because we are a free society. Point of view that can't get government grants, isn't going to get any subsidies the way National Public Radio does, or some of the other outlets that are so liberal and, quite frankly, in my view, just downright biased. But outlets like Point of View have got to depend on just average, regular, hardworking, Bible-believing Americans to provide them a little bit of that help, financial help and prayer help, so that you all can keep going and do the incredible service that you do for this great cause.
Join the cause. Give online at pointofview.net. Call 800-227-1444 or mail Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kirby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Second hour today, as we've been promoting, we're privileged to bring to the microphone Jay Sekulow, Chief Counsel of the American Center for Law and Justice, author of the #1 New York Times bestseller, Rise of ISIS, A Threat You Can't Ignore. You probably will find the book in your local bookstore. I've seen it in all the bookstores where I've been lately, but we also have a link to aclj.org on our website and an opportunity for you to order the book and find out a little bit more about the good work that is done there. Jay Sekulow, always great to have you on the program with us.
Hey, thanks for having me, Kirby. Appreciate it.
Might mention, for those of you that are not familiar with him, and I imagine most of you are, that he has argued some of the most important landmark cases before the Supreme Court of the United States. And Jay, I think some people would think that a book that they would have from you would be on religious liberty or the Constitution, but you also are convinced that the threat from ISIS is a very significant one that you needed to write about.
Well, we've been involved in issues of national security since 9/11 at the ACLJ. We actually opened up an office in Jerusalem. We have an office in Pakistan. We have an office in Strasbourg in France. So we've been involved in the terrorism issue for a while. You're right. In fact, I've got a book coming out in May that is more on the domestic topic.
Sure.
Dealing with government agencies, but we've been involved in the national security issue, and we have a team at the ACLJ that are dedicated to national security issues. What happened, Kirby, in this particular situation with this book is I was asked 2 years ago to give a lecture at Oxford University's Harris Manchester College on terrorism in the Middle East. I did that. Then the next year, this past summer, they asked me to come back and participate in a much broader program. And my topic that I covered at that program at Exeter College at Oxford was ISIS. And this was right before the public beheadings were getting out there, before they were really in the news. And we created, I drafted with our team a series of papers that I presented in discussions and lectures. And when I got back, which was August of last summer, of course, ISIS just started getting in the news in a big way. And our publisher said, we need to get those papers, turn them into a book, and do it quickly. And I came back in August, September 18th. The book came out on the ebook, the Kindle or Nook version of it came out on the ebook. And then the middle of October, it came out. And we went right to paperback. They also put about 10,000 hard copies, hardback. Those are already gone. But the paperback and the ebook have been. I mean, it's been obviously because it's in the news so much. Where it's still a very popular book. And what I think is important about it, we draw a nexus, Kirby, between ISIS and what their ideology is and where they came from. Is this offshoot of Al-Qaeda in Iraq? How Al-Qaeda in Iraq thought that their process that they were engaged in was too extreme even for Al-Qaeda.
Yes.
This is from a group that took airplanes and turned them into bombs, and they thought that now Caliph Ibrahim Abu Bakr, who's the leader of ISIS, they thought he was too extreme. They threw him out, and then, of course, he forms ISIS and establishes this caliphate. So the book traces all of that. There's a tie-in with Hamas and showing the kind of global jihad that's going on. And we don't call them terrorist groups anymore. I'm calling them jihadist armies, because really that's what they are.
And again, I might just mention for our listeners that a lot of that was at the Oxford University History, Politics, and Society program, and it's pulled together. And as I mentioned before you came on the air, we'll talk not only about ISIS, but a little bit about Hamas. And then after you leave, my commentary today on the Taliban. A little bit later, I'll talk about Sharia law. But explain for some that have maybe not heard you or seen you on Sean Hannity or some of the other programs that you've done, this idea of this new caliphate, because many people think that this is just sort of a civil war or a rebel band, but they have a much more extensive kind of vision, don't they?
Well, they've got it. Look, I mean, the goal here is the establishment. I mean, you're going to be talking about Sharia law later, but they take this view of Sharia law, which requires the reestablishment of a global caliphate. The caliphate is an Islamic world. So they're not. I mean, they look at right now. You're talking about Syria and Iraq. But the fact of the matter is, look at the way their name has changed. So it was initially, and we still know them as ISIS. That's the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq and Syria. Then it became ISIL, which was the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant. The Levant, of course, includes the greater Middle East, Jordan, Israel, Egypt, and now it's just Islamic State. And the fact of the matter is that when they established the global caliphate, they changed the paradigm at which they were operating as compared with, say, Al-Qaeda, where Al-Qaeda is hiding in caves. They more the clandestine, what we call the more typical terrorist activity, small cell groups, this kind of thing. ISIS is an army. I mean, they're not hiding in caves. They have armies. They control vast territories. They have revenue. They control cities. They have oil revenue. I mean, they're taking in millions of dollars a day, and the latest reports indicate that they probably have 50,000 standing troops in uniform for ISIS right now. So this global caliphate is nothing new to Islam, unfortunately. I mean, the Islamic tendency or desire for domination is as old as the religion itself.
Wow. You know, in the chapter that you have, chapter 3, where you talk about it being a powerful jihadist army, I think I might start using that kind of explanation, because when you talk about ISIS or ISIL, people don't really kind of understand that you have a standing army. They have money from bank accounts, from oil revenues, even from the sex trade and all the other things. So you have something that is perhaps larger and more powerful than any of some of the countries that they now are attacking. Is that fair?
Yeah, because, I mean, we say this in the book, that ISIS has emerged not just as the most ruthless of the Sunni jihadist organizations, it's also the most successful. And you know, I'd like them to be crushed and eliminated. I think that's the only way that you can handle them. But the fact of the matter is they have been very successful in their evil, in their terror. But it is a jihadist army. And, Kirby, that's why I think, you know, when we say terrorist organizations, what are we thinking about right now? We think about terrorists. We think about what happened in Boston. We think about what happened, which was horrible, and they're all horrible. I mean, what happened in France, again, that was a jihadi network. That was a terrorist attack. The president doesn't want to call it that, but that's what the president keeps calling it, random. Mm-hmm. But the fact of the matter is there's probably a connect there with ISIS. No one knows for sure yet. But ISIS, you have to view these groups differently. These are armies. I mean, these are, just look at them as if you're fighting a nation state, because in reality, that's what you're doing. There's a reason the president's calling for war authorization on ISIS. This was a group he called the JV team 16 months ago. And now we're in a real war. I've said this, and I want people that are listening to understand what I mean by this. We are in World War III. Okay? It's not, this could lead to, we are in World War III. What is a world war? It's multi-states with multi-enemies, not necessarily one state is the enemy, where you've got global convergence. Exactly what you have here. The question will be, you know, I don't think anybody doubts that we have the ability to crush them. I say this in the book. We have the capability to crush ISIS with our allies very quickly. They don't have an army. They don't have an air force. So we have the air power. We have, if we need them, we've got troops. We could crush ISIS really, really quickly. The question is not can we. The question is, do we have the will to do it? And do we understand this as a threat? I mean, the president keeps comparing this to climate change, for goodness sake. So, I mean, this is bordering on the absurd. And the reason we wrote the book was so that people that are listening to this broadcast today understand that when we talk about the rise of ISIS, they are still rising. I mean, this is not a threat we have contained. It's a threat we can't ignore. And I think what has to happen here is we need to get our people educated to the nature of this global jihadist threat, that you've got to look at them not in isolation even by themselves, but their ally Hamas, another 20,000 troops. It means 75,000 at least in the region.
We'll take a break and continue our conversation with Jay Sekulow right after this.
The Point of View Commentary with Kirby Anderson.
You know, White House spokesmen have lately been claiming that the Taliban is not a terrorist organization. We can speculate as to why the Obama administration is making this argument in just a moment, but let's look at the facts. Under federal law, a group qualifies as a foreign terrorist organization if it meets three requirements. First, it must be foreign. Second, it must be engaged in terrorist activity, which would include bombings or assassinations. And third, it must be a national security threat to the United States. I would think that anyone looking at the facts would have to conclude that the Taliban in Afghanistan qualifies as a terrorist organization. The reason the U.S. sent troops into Afghanistan was due to its involvement in global jihad. When the Taliban ruled Afghanistan, they allowed groups like al-Qaeda to set up headquarters there and attack U.S. embassies and eventually to attack America on 9/11. The Taliban still has alliances with groups like al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, and the Muslim Brotherhood. Andrew McCarthy believes he knows the reason why the current administration does not want to call the Taliban a terrorist organization. They try to distinguish between insurgents and terrorists. To them, an insurgency is a domestic uprising. But if they use terrorist tactics, McCarthy argues that at the very least they should be called domestic terrorists, and the Taliban is more than just an Afghanistan phenomenon. Andrew McCarthy understands these issues. He's a former federal prosecutor who convicted the notorious Blind Sheikh and other jihadists who attempted in 1993 to destroy the World Trade Center. McCarthy believes the Obama administration continues to reject the terrorist label for the Taliban because the administration wants to negotiate with the Taliban. As a nation, we've rejected the idea of negotiating with terrorists because that might encourage them to engage in more terrorist acts. Instead, the administration believes it should negotiate with the Taliban as insurgents. This administration may not want to call the Taliban a terrorist organization, but their attempt doesn't square with the facts. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
As we mentioned just a minute ago, President Obama has sent to Congress a draft proposal for a war resolution against the Islamic State, and this would be for the limited use of American force, but would certainly involve ground troops. With us for just a few more minutes, Jay Sekulow, who again is Chief Counsel of the American Center for Law and Justice, and of course author of the book we're talking about, the New York Times bestseller, Rise of ISIS. Just before we went to the break, Jay, you talked about Hamas, and that's another section in your book. You talk about Hamas, the architects of eternal jihad. Many people, sadly, including the president, see these as isolated groups, Muslim Brotherhood over here and Hamas over here and ISIS over here and al-Qaeda over here. They see these different events as isolated. You see them much more coordinated than a lot of people, or even the president seems to see them.
Yeah, because I think there's a connection here that you can't ignore, and that is, what is the aim and goal of these groups? So when you look at the situation, what is the aim of ISIS? Well, it's ISIS wants to establish a global caliphate. Read the charter of Hamas. It's exactly the same thing. They view, Hamas' greatest attack point right now is at Israel. But the fact of the matter is you've got a group coming from the kind of, west to east. That's Hamas. You've got ISIS coming from the east to the west. And what's the converging point? Well, they want to get rid of Jordan's king, believe me. I mean, they want all them out of the way. They want Egypt out of the way. But they want to destroy Israel, and then they've got sites much greater than that. So I think we're really naive if we look at these groups in isolation. And I'll take it a step further. We have a program that we do at Oxford, as I mentioned, and we're going to be in March dealing with Turkey. I mean, Turkey is a NATO ally.
Yes.
Kirby, the Sunni connect between Turkey and ISIS, it's the direct funnel, both for the money, that's where the black market oil is being sold, but for people trying to get in the country to fight. with joining ISIS, they're going through Turkey.
Turkey's not the Turkey under Ataturk, and it certainly has become more radical every single day. While we're on Hamas for just a minute, you have a whole chapter here on Hamas, Israel's most relentless enemy. A little bit later, we're going to talk about whether it's right for senators and congressmen to boycott the speech by the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu. But what about for our listeners, and I think almost all of our listeners are very concerned about the fate of Israel, and Hamas and ISIS pose a very significant threat. How so?
Well, they throw because their goal is so clear. And look, these are groups that will do anything to get their way. They'll kill kids. They crucify Christians. They sell young girls into slavery. They use hospitals. Hamas takes a hospital, uses it as a launching point for missiles. So they have actually used. We laid the case out in the book. Why Hamas? You know, when they would say Israel's guilty of war crimes. That's kind of the mantra from the left. You hear that over and over again. Oh, the Israelis, the occupiers, they're guilty of war crimes. Well, we looked at the law of war and what's a crime under, what's a war crime. And the fact of the matter is we've laid out, and I think we've done a really effective job of this in our book, we've laid out why it is, in fact, Hamas that is violating the laws of war, and they're the ones engaged in war crimes when you take civilians as shields, when you use hospitals and schools as launching points, and yet, you know, the UN does nothing on that. You barely hear a peep. But you've got Israel being, you know, not only tarnished, but the threats of they call Israel the apartheid state. I mean, this is not reality. And frankly, the president's not helping the situation with this chilly relationship that exists between Israel and at least between the prime minister of Israel and the president. I don't think the people of Israel have any I know there's not an anti-U.S. view, and I know most Americans are very supportive of the Jewish state. But the reality is that at the top, there's tension in the relationship. But when you look at Hamas, understand their goal, eliminate Israel as a Jewish state.
Wow. You know, there are a lot of things in your book, and you talk about ISIS and Hamas, but you mentioned one just in passing. I thought I'd also at least have you talk about it for a second. In one of the chapters, you talk about how they're using this idea of war crimes. The United Nations is even trying to transform some of our soldiers into war criminals.
Right. It's called lawfare. What you do is you take a international institution like the United Nations, and you turn the existing law so that you utilize the existing mechanisms within the UN to delegitimize a nation state. Here, the nation state that's being delegitimized is Israel, and that's precisely and exactly what's happening right now. So you've got a situation where you have the UN, the International Criminal Court in The Hague. I've litigated at the ICC, and we've won on behalf of Israel. But the fact of the matter, it keeps coming back up. And that is this, it's lawfare. We put that in the book because I think we're making, Kirby, a huge mistake if we look at ISIS in isolation. We have to look at ISIS as we look at Hamas, as we look at the points where they intersect and how they're utilizing social media, how they're utilizing military-like tactics, and understand that this is a real threat. I mean, when we wrote the book, we called it Rise of ISIS, a threat we can't ignore. The reason we said a threat we can't ignore was the United States was ignoring it. And the president called them the JV team. So we took that on head on. I mean, the book really delves into why you cannot ignore the threat that exists right now.
It's just a great book because it covers much more than just ISIS. That's worth it alone. But then Hamas, the issue of war criminals, the fact that there really are war crimes out there and Hamas is engaged in it. So it's an excellent book. And just in the next few minutes, because I wanted to give you some time to talk about what is available at the American Center for Law and Justice. As you well know, your good friend Kelly Shackelford joins us every Friday. And I say time and time again, you need to support some of these religious organizations, religious liberty organizations, whether it's ACLG or Liberty Institute. Of course, we've had Matt Staver on, Liberty Counsel, and others. You guys are doing such an important work, and how can people support your ministry? And tell us what we can do to begin to address some of these issues you've talked about.
Well, the best for information, ACLJ.org is a great place to go, but also I'd encourage people to go to Facebook. We have a very active Facebook for both the American Center for Law and Justice, and I have one too, Jay Sekulow. So you can go to either Jay Sekulow or American Center for Law and Justice, like our Facebook pages. We're very active on Facebook and Twitter as well. As far as getting information about the book, the best place to get the book is in Amazon, because you get it online, or Barnes and Noble. Those are or wherever you sell books. But if you're looking to just order one quickly, it's Amazon and Barnes and Noble have them in stock, and will continue to. So, but I encourage people to get the information. We keep these topics updated. I mean, multiple. We have a big staff, Kirby, that deals with social media, so we can keep people engaged and informed on what's going on. And I encourage people to do that, to like our Facebook pages and also to go to aclj.org. We send out email alerts every day. And you mentioned the good work of my friend Kelly Shackelford, who does a great job supporting organizations like his, like the ACLJ. That's how we're able to do what we do. And any support there we appreciate. But, again, for the book, the best place is either Amazon, Barnes & Noble, wherever books are sold in your area.
Let me encourage some of you maybe just to get it on your tablet. I have it on Kindle and got it when it first came out and got it right here. And it's just a great resource. And you will learn a lot about what is happening around the world. And again, Jay, I appreciate the fact that you have taken the stand for so many different issues and that you have various headquarters around the world. I run into people that are associated with you, and I think the world of your organization. Appreciate you joining us today here on Point of View.
Appreciate it. Thanks for your work and supporting our work for all these years. It's been great. Thank you, Kirby.
Jay Sekulow, and as you go to aclj.org, we have some links there to his Facebook page. He regularly blogs on BeliefNet. Of course, he also has a column on Town Hall, so you can follow him on Twitter and Facebook, and all of those resources are available, and we have those links on the website, pointofview.net. We've posted a couple of articles here today that you can react to. One in this last half hour, of course, was the opening comments I made about Brian Williams and what might be happening in the news business right now. That's still fair game. We've also talked a little bit about the prayer breakfast and the comments by the president, and you've had a chance to hear from a couple of individuals, including, of course, the material from Dennis Prager, as well as from Ravi Zacharias, and also read from a few others, Jerry Newcomb. And then in this last half hour, I do want to talk a little bit about the Taliban. That's my commentary today, the unwillingness of the president in part to identify it as a foreign terrorist organization. I'll go into that. And then we'll get into the issue of Sharia law. We're learning a lot more about how that is showing up in our courts. And if we have time, and I think we might have time, there is a big issue about whether or not certain members of Congress will actually attend the speech that will be given by the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu. So for those of you that are looking for an action item, I want to give you an action item in just a few minutes. A number of people have gotten together, including our good friend Gary Bauer, who I'm hoping might join us later this week, and Bill Kristol, and some others who are addressing this issue of the boycott that is now being proposed against the message by the Prime Minister of Israel. So lots to cover, and if you would like to join us on any of those topics this last half hour, once again, an open line, 1-800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212. This is an opportunity for you to express your opinion. Love to get some dialogue on many of these topics we've put on the table, and so it is your opportunity to express your opinion, and we'd love to hear from you. As you go to the website, you're going to find all sorts of articles we've posted today, including a link so that you could get this book, Rise of ISIS. It is a good read. It is a simple read. It's a little shorter than typical books, so I think you should get a copy of it either in print or put it on one of your tablets and read it and learn a lot more about what is happening around the world. When we come back, we'll take your phone calls, 1-800-351-1212, and we'll put some more topics on the table. All that coming up right after this.
A devastating disease is loose in the United States, dishing out pain and loss beyond measure. The menace is sin. Its debilitating results include faulty reason and harmful attitudes. Our children and grandchildren need you to step up right now and help Point of View make a difference. Kirby and the team have the antidote for what ails us, the good news of Jesus Christ and His prescriptions for all of life and culture. But to distribute this antidote costs about $65 each minute we're on the air. Step up today. Help us deliver the antidote. Give $65 and underwrite a minute, or $130 and give Kirby a platform for 2 minutes. Give online. Use the donate button at pointofview.net or call 1-800-227-1444 or send your donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. 1 minute, $65. 2 minutes, $130. Do more if you can, but do something today. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
Half hour, if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. You can see as I look on my computer here that some of you want to talk about Islam, some want to talk about Israel. Let me get to that Israel issue in just a minute, but I'll take one of these calls related to Islam and the rise of radical Islam and the jihadist army. So we'll go to Missouri first, KTTK. Manfred, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Kirby, for having me on again once again. I just got to tell you, I know about the Quran. I've heard about the Quran and such, and I know the Muslims. I read about the Muslims through the crossing the shadow of the crescent. And you know, if they all have read the Quran, they all believe the same. You know, they got to believe the same of what it says. And to me, there is no radical Muslims or any really lower Muslims, as far as I'm concerned, what the president says about. And I understand Angela Merkel, the president of Germany, has closed the mosques in Germany once they found that they have found out they're using them for fronts for the Muslims, for the ISIS groups. And also, why aren't they doing the same here in the U.S.? Why are they letting them continue to thrive and go on and build more and more and more?
Okay, let me try to respond to both of them. You can stay on the line here, but the first point I make is, and you can read some of it in my book, Biblical Point of View in Islam, but you can find it in other books as well, is if you did take a literal interpretation of the various verses of the sword in the Quran, and there are quite a number, many of them are found in Surah 9, which is the 9th chapter of the Quran, then you would have to probably come to a conclusion that indeed Muhammad was commanding people not only in the 7th or 8th century, but also in the 21st century to go out and to fight a jihad. Now, first of all, not every Muslim understands or reads the Quran. Number two, sometimes they contextualize that Quran in that they say, well, those might have applied in Muhammad's day. They are not binding for us today. So that's why you have the, quote, so-called moderate Muslims. But then, Manfred, your point's well taken. Even if they read that, some of them reinterpret what jihad is. They believe that it's an intellectual jihad. We'll eventually establish a universal caliphate, but we don't have to do it at the end of a gun, or back in the 7th century, the end of a sword. So that's why you still have individuals who are not posing a threat. But on the one hand, I don't want to paint with a broad brush, but I don't want to be like the president, paint with a paintbrush or a little small ink brush, because there is room in between those two extremes to really accurately, I think, describe the fact that there are lots and lots of radical Muslims around the world, and that we should pay attention to them. And to say that they aren't using the Quran to justify their actions is just wrong. Your second point's really well taken, and that is what has happened in many of these countries. You've mentioned Angela Merkel in Germany, but you could talk about some of the concerns in the UK and the Netherlands. The messages that are given in many of these mosques are very radical. And the last time we had Frank Gaffney on this program, and the last time we had Steve Emerson on the program, these are two different individuals, but they've oftentimes worked together. They've actually evaluated some of the messages given on Friday in American mosques and concluded that at least half of those messages should concern the Department of Homeland Security. So I think maybe a future president might begin to say, we have a much bigger problem in terms of creating radical ideas in these mosques than presently this president wants to admit. So I think your point's well taken. I appreciate you calling. Any follow-up?
Thank you.
Okay. I appreciate you giving us a call today. And if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. I think Alicia wants to talk about the Israeli Prime Minister, and she's calling in from WGNN in North Carolina. You have the floor.
Hi. I just wanted to make a comment that I think that the American people, along with the Democrats that are planning to boycott the President or Prime Minister of Israel coming, I believe they're short-sighted and that they're wrong. This is a man that's not doing this for personal gain or any notoriety for himself. His sole purpose is to protect his country, and to taking it personal as a slight for us to take it personal as a slight towards our president, it's just wrong. It's just wrong.
Well, I'm going to give everybody an action item, and Alicia, you can decide if you want to follow up on it as well. We are posting it right now on the website, so it'll be there in a few minutes. But you can write this number down in just a minute for calling the Capitol Hill switchboard. But let me, first of all, read the statement that came from William Kristol, who is the chairman of the Emergency Committee for Israel, and Gary Bauer, who we're hoping will be on with us maybe later this week, Christians United for Israel Action Fund. And this is their statement. They said in mid-January, the Speaker of the House of Representatives invited the Prime Minister of Israel to address Congress. The Prime Minister accepted the invitation. He will deliver the remarks to the joint session of Congress on March 3rd. Some senators and congressmen are now threatening to boycott the speech. Whatever their intentions and reasons, their actions will be construed at home and abroad as a victory for the enemies of Israel and the enemies of a strong U.S.-Israel relationship. Some members of Congress claim to be upset that the Speaker may have violated protocol or blindsided the administration by inviting the Prime Minister. But then why take their anger out on the Prime Minister and thereby on the state of Israel? Before I continue reading that, there's some evidence that the White House did know about this, and all of this has been trumped up. But let's continue on with the statement by William Kristol and Gary Bauer. They say others claim that the speech will somehow help the Prime Minister in his re-election campaign, as if Israeli voters are going to base their choice on one speech to the U.S. Congress, a speech in which the Israeli Prime Minister will reiterate arguments about Iran's nuclear program with which the major opposition parties agree and on which there is national unity. The bottom line is simple. The enemies of Israel benefit most from this campaign against the Israeli Prime Minister's speech. Whatever their views on Israeli politics or the Iranian nuclear negotiations, members of Congress who are friends of Israel should not play into the hands of Israel's enemies and America's by boycotting this speech. Boycotting Israel is high on the agenda of the enemies of Israel. Welcoming Israel's prime minister to the halls of Congress is the least that those who claim to be friends of the Jewish state should do. As representatives of two proudly pro-Israel organizations, we urge members of Congress to do the right thing for the United States and Israel, and for those who would turn their backs on Israel and boycott its leader, they are no friends of Israel, and we pledge to do our best to educate voters about their undermining of Israel and the U.S.-Israel relationship at this crucial hour. That was, of course, written, as I mentioned a minute ago, by William Kristol and Gary Bauer. And my action item for you is to call Capitol Hill and tell your representative and your senators that you expect them to attend the joint session of Congress. If you want that number, it will be posted on our website, but I can give it to you right now, 202-224-3121. And again, this is something that we are encouraging you to take action. The information about all of this will be on the website that you can find at pointofview.net. But again, if you want to contact your representative and your two U.S. senators, that number is 202-224-3121. Tell them which states you're from and their location. They will connect you to the appropriate people, and that will give you a great opportunity for some kind of action. And Alicia, that's kind of my action item for today. What do you think?
I think it's excellent, and I will do that. I've been posting things on Facebook in support of Israel, Israel's prime minister to come as well. Unfortunately, I'm not very encouraged because I believe Democrats are using it as a political issue versus a real issue of concern.
Well, again, as Bill Kristol and especially Gary Bauer said, they will do their best to educate voters about this when elections come up again. So there are some action items for you, and today my commentary is on the Taliban. When we come back from the break, I'll talk about that issue. And if we don't have time today, we'll get into the issue of Sharia law and some of the things we've uncovered in the last couple of days in that regard, and giving you a chance to also maybe know how to articulate some of your concerns in that. Certainly lots to cover today, but I have one of those mandatory breaks coming up, so let's take the time to go to that break. But when we come back, we'll take some of your phone calls if you'd like to join us. And don't forget that tomorrow, in our second hour, we're going to have Michael Yosef with us, his book, Jesus, Jihad, and Peace, What Bible Prophecy Says About World Events. He'll certainly have some comments about ISIS, the Taliban, Hamas, and much more, so we'll be covering some of these same issues tomorrow. And, of course, on our Friday weekend edition, we'll get into that as well. So lots to cover. Let's take a break. When we come back, if you would like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. I told you at the outset we'd spend a lot of time talking about Islam. We have. We have a little bit more to talk about, and that will happen right after these messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. As you go to our website, we're going to post in just a minute the action alert, what I just mentioned a minute ago when I was talking with Alicia. And if you would like to express your opinion to your members of Congress, you're one member of the House of Representatives, you're 2 U.S. Senators, we're going to make that available to you and give you a couple of ideas of what to say, as we are concerned about the fact that some members of Congress have said that they will boycott the speech by Benjamin Netanyahu. We'll talk more about that in just a few minutes, and we'll probably have Gary Bauer on in a few days to go into that in even more detail. My commentary today is on the Taliban, and I know it's hard to keep track of all these organizations. We've talked about Al-Qaeda, we've talked about ISIS, we've talked about Hamas, Let's talk about the Taliban for just a minute. My commentary today is the fact that you are seeing that the spokespeople for the White House are claiming that the Taliban is not a terrorist organization. We can speculate as to why they say that in just a minute, but let's get back to the facts. Under federal law, a group qualifies as a foreign terrorist organization if it meets 3 requirements. Number 1, it must be foreign. Okay, check, that one works. Number 2, it must be engaged in what's called terrorist activity. That's well defined in the federal law. It includes things like bombings and assassinations. I think everybody knows that's what the Taliban's been doing for decades. Number 3, it must be a national security threat to the United States. Well, I think that one's probably true as well, but I go on in my commentary to point out that you'd have to conclude that because, after all, it was a terrorist organization. It was really the reason that we sent our troops to Afghanistan in the first place, because of their involvement in global jihad. When the Taliban ruled Afghanistan, they allowed groups like al-Qaeda, including Osama bin Laden, to set up headquarters there and attack embassies and eventually attack the United States on 9/11. And it still has alliances with groups like al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, and the Muslim Brotherhood. So I think all that fits. Okay, second question then. If indeed it is a foreign terrorist organization, why is it that instead the White House won't call it such? And that goes to Andrew McCarthy. He wrote a piece a while back in which he says that he has a pretty good idea as to why the current administration does not want to call the Taliban a terrorist organization. They make a distinction between insurgents and terrorists. To them, an insurgency is just a domestic uprising. But if they use terrorist tactics, Andrew McCarthy said, well, okay, even if you want to call them an insurgency that is using terrorist tactics, that's at very least a domestic terrorist organization. And it's certainly involved in more than just inside the borders of Afghanistan, which makes it obviously a terrorist organization. But, you know, if nothing else, we have to recognize that Andrew McCarthy's kind of been in this business before. He was a former federal prosecutor. He's the one that actually convicted the notorious Blind Sheikh and other jihadists who attempted in 1993 to destroy the World Trade Center the first time. And he also believes that the Obama administration is rejecting this terrorist label for the Taliban because the administration wants to negotiate with the Taliban. You know, as a nation, we've had a policy, we don't negotiate with terrorists. So if we want to negotiate, we have to call them something other than what? Terrorists. So we'll call them insurgents. And that's certainly, I think, why that simple kind of gaming of names is taking place. But it simply does not, as I point out in my commentary, square with the facts. If you don't receive my daily commentary, let me encourage you to do so. There's a place for you to sign up and do so, and we would encourage you to receive them. I send it out every morning, or actually Point of View sends it out every morning to you, and it lands in your inbox. And so whether you have a chance to hear it or not, you can receive it free of charge. It's one of the ways in which you can get some other facts and information, and that's certainly going to be very helpful to you. And as we've talked about before, many times, because if we do have your email for that, we can also send out some of the action alerts, and that's certainly one thing we can do as we're talking about the need for us to express our opinions today to those members of Congress that are thinking about boycotting the speech by Benjamin Netanyahu. Just before we go, though, I've got a commentary that will be coming out in just a few days on Sharia law in America. And if you've been paying attention, you know that there are a lot of states now that have actually passed, either through the legislature or through a ballot measure, a ban on Sharia law. And these are states like Alabama, Arizona, Kansas, Louisiana, South Dakota, North Carolina, Tennessee. Our listeners in Oklahoma know that they passed a ban, but then it was struck down by a federal appeals court. Some of our listeners in Missouri know that the legislature passed a ban on foreign law, but the governor vetoed it. But nevertheless, the argument is being made time and time again that we really don't need this. And yet the report that came out from the Center for Security Policy, it's entitled Sharia Law and the American State Courts, found 50 significant cases of Sharia law in the U.S. courts. That's just in their small sample of appellate published case. When they went to state courts, they found 15 more cases in the trial courts, 12 more in the appellate courts. But bottom line is that a number of judges are making decisions deferring to Sharia law, even when those decisions conflict with the U.S. Constitution. So as we wind down today, I wanted to help give you a way to make the case. If you're talking to a legislator, maybe you're talking to a family member, a friend, a coworker, or something like that, remember these three numbers: 1, 8, and 14. 1, 8, and 14. And those represent three different amendments. The First Amendment would be 1, and that is that there should be no establishment of religion. Well, if you implement Sharia law, you are establishing a religion. We can't establish any kind of national religion, even Islam. So 1 stands for the First Amendment. 8 stands for the Eighth Amendment. What's the Eighth Amendment? Well, that's the one that prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. I think most people, as they've seen some of the penalties handed down under Sharia law, would call those cruel and unusual punishment. And then 14, that would be the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment guarantees every citizen equal protection under the Constitution. Sharia law does not treat men and women equally. It does not treat Muslim and non-Muslims equally. This violates the Constitution. So my argument is, if you want Sharia law in America, you have to repeal the First Amendment, the Eighth Amendment, and the 14th Amendment. Or accurately, the next time somebody says, well, I don't really have a problem with Sharia law. If the Muslims want to have Sharia law, that's fine. Just remember the numbers 1, 8, and 14. The First Amendment, the Eighth Amendment, and the 14th Amendment, and recognize that that's why Sharia law is unconstitutional. One last time, if you are interested in expressing your opinion to your member of Congress, we are going to be posting on our website and educating you more about this, the fact that you can call your elected representatives, 202-224-3121, and tell them that you believe that they should attend the joint session of Congress when the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, speaks on March 3rd, and encourage them not to boycott that. Even if they disagree with the Prime Minister, this certainly as a boycott would embolden and be an encouragement to the enemies of Israel and the enemies of a strong U.S.-Israeli relationship. So that's your action item for today. You can read my commentary on the Taliban in our viewpoint section, and then you can go to the button that says See More and find the various columns that we have posted today on everything from Brian Williams to the President's speech at the National Prayer Breakfast. So that's all we have for today. I mentioned that tomorrow we'll have Michael Yosef in the second hour. First hour, we're going to be talking with Michael Whitmer, and I think you're going to enjoy that program. And don't forget that, of course, Friday is our weekend edition, and so you can find out all about the various programs by going to our website, pointofview.net. I want to thank Doug, as well as Andrew, who was here for a while, and Catherine and Chris for the help behind the scenes. Have a great day. We'll see you back here tomorrow.
Each one of us has so much to be thankful for. And here at Point of View, we're thankful that we can serve and support you.
I don't think I could do what I do without Point of View on a daily basis.
I just can't even begin to tell you how much that this ministry has meant to me, especially now being a father, the values and things that I hear on Point of View and how you shaped my worldview and made me passionate.
Point of View is a very unique ministry and gives us a Christian perspective.
Thank you very much for what you guys do. Believe me, it's a needed thing, and I just hope everybody certainly would get on the bandwagon with you.
I can't see a better way to invest in our future than to support Point of View.
We are so very thankful for you. Can we count you as a thankful listener? Please show your gratitude. Give $30 a month or give $100. Give online at pointofview.net. Pointofview.net. Call 800-227-1444 or mail to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.